everybody. This is Ryan McClanahan with historythroughcards.com. Hope you're all doing very well today. We often don't consider the legislation that surrounds our sports cards, and well, kind of for good reason too, because it's kind of boring. But in this case, I'm going to try to make it a little lively, if you will. Um, it's really kind of interesting because I was going to talk about the Hobbies Act of 1973, but before I do that, I wanted to kind of ease you into it by talking about past legislation that surrounds our sports cards, and specifically that of the 1909 T206. Now, that is a fascinating set all by itself, and you can spend your whole entire hobby career just studying the T206, T205, and T207. And at some point, I should have a book out on these specific sets and what goes on around them. But in the meantime, here, what I wanted to tell you is that those cards were born out of legislation and they died through legislation as well. And that seems kind of strange, right? But in 1894, there was a congressman from Maryland named Arthur P. Gorman, and he's kind of interesting because he was a former baseball player in the late 1850s and 1860s, and he became a congressman afterwards. His wife said, "You can either play baseball or you can marry me, but you can't do both." And so he married the girl and gave up baseball, but he was really one of the founders of the Washington Statesman Baseball Club, or the Washington Senators. It's one of the only known cards that I'm aware of Arthur P. Gorman, and he also was on a committee to study whether or not baseball was an American sport, the national pastime, if you will, in 1903, and he passed away in 1903 as well. And that's a kind of an interesting committee because it was a committee that never sat, and they said, yes, by the way, baseball is a purely American sport, and it is not a derivative of cricket. Anyway, that's another story for another time. In 1894, Arthur P. Gorman instituted the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, and it lowered tariffs, but it also added an income tax for the very first time. And the following year, in 1895, it was considered unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court yanked it. And then in 1897, it was replaced by the Dingley Tariff Act. And what tariffs did was to supply the United States with cash. There were three ways that the government produced income because we didn't have an income tax, and that was through the sin taxes, if you will, alcohol, tobacco, and then tariffs. And then in 1913, we instituted the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax, and it's really kind of been interesting ever since. And I will get into income and taxes in another video because I'm going to have to split this one in two actually. The first video here I'm going to talk about is the 1973 Hobby Act. And then usually when you're talking about legislation, somehow you're also going to have to talk about taxes and what the IRS covers and Federal Trade Commission and all these government regulated agencies somehow come into play. And I think it kind of causes a little bit of confusion with a lot of citizens. I hate to say this, but we're not that educated anymore on civics. When I was a kid, my civics lessons stopped about probably the seventh grade. And so I learned a lot through sports cards, and I relearned a lot of this stuff through sports cards as well. I'm not going to say everything I learned was through sports cards. I did learn quite a bit in school, just the basics though. Anything else I had to kind of learn on my own, and I'm still learning today. And like I always say, guys, learn as much as you can. Don't leave it up to somebody else to teach you. I will kind of guide you along and show you certain aspects of the hobby and collecting and players and all this other stuff, especially civics and economics here. But I want you to learn on your own. We are a generation that is really a push button generation where we have information literally at the tips of our fingers, yet we don't utilize this information. And sometimes the things that we read, they may be a little confusing or we misinterpret what we're reading. And that does happen kind of quite often, even for me. So what I'll usually do as a reporter is I'll go directly to the source. If I'm confused about any kind of piece of legislation that I'm reading or writing about, or any kind of economic situation, I'll go directly to the source and I'll call them up or email them and get a response back. Sometimes it doesn't work out all that well. Uh, just as a side note, I was trying to find out about a decision that Kennesaw Mountain Landis made in 1936 regarding the St. Louis Cardinals and Branch Rickey. I went directly to Cooperstown and spoke with them. They didn't have this document of Branch Rickey's, which is kind of surprising to me, and they told me that I had to go to the Library of Congress. So when I called up the Library of Congress and talked to them, they went through their files on Branch Rickey, and they didn't have this specific document. And I went back to Cooperstown and told them, and then a week later they found this document, and I can understand why uh, they would be kind of hesitant to say that this document was in Branch Rickey's personal files, which apparently he gave to the Library of Congress, where somebody did in his family. And I actually wrote a little bit about this in my look into the 1941 double play Johnny Mize, and you can read that in my website. So in 1897, the Gorman Act was replaced by the Dinley Tariff Act, and what that did was it banned sports cards. In fact, they were not called sports cards then, and there was a whole array of tobacco cards. They didn't really call them that, obviously. These things were called picture cards for the most part, or sporting pictures or something else, because the term baseball card really wasn't invented until sometime in the 1930s. However, I read this particular section because I am kind of nerdy like that. Probably not in a good nerd way, but on page 186, section 3394 is where you're going to find a specific section that uh, the Commissioner of Revenue Service in 1908 had referenced why these tobacco cards were banned in the first place. John W. Yerkes, and I actually wrote about him in my look into the 1909 T206, and I actually found a picture of this guy too. So I did some deep dive reporting here, and I'm not sure how I feel about this. Just don't tell any of the girls that I did any of this because I will never get a date again. Yerkes testified before Congress as to why these things were basically banned in 1908. And the next year was the Payne Aldrich tariff, and that reinstituted tobacco cards into packages, and it started the T206. But that wasn't the only piece of legislation either that helped the T206 form. In fact, uh, that was the Copyright Act of 1909, which is very important. And then there's another statute from New York State where it was basically one of the first privacy acts of the country, and have also written extensively about that as well. The Robertson case, she had actually lost her case in 1903, but that did institute the Personal Privacy Act of 1903 from the state of New York. And that is one of the reasons why the ball players had to sign off on a permission slip, if you will, for the companies to print their cards. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a T206 or any other card for that matter if it wasn't for the Copyright Act of 1909. And I want to say that these picture cards or the T206 will be found in Section K of the Copyright Act of 1909. It's been a while since I've actually read that, but I did read the entire thing and I reported on copyright and all that stuff. That's another story, and that will bore even me and put me to sleep, which it did on several occasions. I've kind of spoken about the 1909 T206 in great length, just kind of how historic that particular set is. It is very historic. It might not be my favorite set in the world, but I do recognize the importance of it. There is a series of books that was published by the government between 1911 and 1913 on the dissolution of the American Tobacco Company. And it's kind of like a step by step process on how they did this and how they figured out that American tobacco was a monopoly and what to do about it. And I think it's kind of important for you guys to understand about how our sports cards evolved and how our hobby grew from Jefferson Burdick, even before Jefferson Burdick, all the way to now. I think it's really fascinating, and maybe some of you guys might think it's fascinating too. So, in the Revenue Bureau's code, regulation number 8, section 135A, which I had actually put into my article on the T206 set, there is going to be found, and I'll show it to you right here. This is actually a T207. I love this set. This is awesome. And I'll be talking more about this set in my book. But on the back here, you can find, and I'm sorry guys, it's really kind of blurry. I'll see if I can try to do something about that. So you can see right down here, there is a factory number 240, First District, Pennsylvania. That was due to the Dingley Tariff Act, and you had to have that code on the back of any kind of gifts or premiums, and it would match the package, and that was a way for the Revenue Service to track all the purchases that was made and the revenue that was coming in. That ended in about 1913 because you didn't need tariffs for the most part now because you had income from people and from companies. So fast forward to 1972, and there's a really interesting article that I read uh, from the Sport Fan, and I think Bob Jasperson, who was the editor of the magazine, he ended up writing about this, and so he's talking about a Hobby Act, and that ended up being proposed by a Republican New York senator by the name of Seymour Halpern. And Seymour Halpern actually was a collector. He wasn't a collector of sports cards, but he collected autographs and artwork. And he's also kind of known for being a co sponsor of the 1964 Civil Rights Act as well. I kind of have a knack for finding really obscure politicians and people, and it's like a gift, really. It's like a superhero power. I don't know why you'd want that, but I apparently do have it. So, um, I can't play baseball anymore, but I can find obscure people and obscure facts. And then, so I'm going to go over this article, and I'm also going to go over a few other articles on this specific thing because I think it's really kind of interesting. New York Rep. Halpern addresses Congress on Hobby Protection Act, which is designed to protect millions of hobbyists in America. Editor's note: the world of sports collectors received a severe jolt recently when it was disclosed by a number of card collectors that they had been the victims of fraudulent dealers. The deceptive practice of passing off card reproductions for originals is said to be widespread, extending from Delaware to the West Coast. Other hobby papers have also altered collectors to be on their guard. It was first brought to our attention by Tom Collier of Chesapeake City, Maryland, one of the several card collectors who has been victimized. However, the picture isn't all gloomy, and a bill now before Congress offers protection for card collectors. Any collector ceasing to support this bill and get it before a committee for action should write to Rep. Harley O. Staggers, Chairman, House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, Washington, D.C. 20515. Every card collector should drop a line to Rep. Staggers to let him know you're behind him. After all, it is you whom this bill is designed to protect. Below is a reprint from the February 8, 1972 Congressional Record. Our thanks to Mel Bailey for sending us a copy of it. H.R. 10600 Hobby Bill. Speaker pro temp under previous order of the House of Gentlemen from New York, Mr. Halpern is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Halpern. Mr. Speaker, I wish to call the attention of the Congress a most important bill presently pending action in the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee. I refer to my own H.R. 10600, the bill protect the Hobby Protection Act. Introduced this past summer, the bill offers specific and detailed protection for the millions of hobbyists in America. The collector, whether of antique guns, stamps, or historic documents, faces a constant threat of imitation or reproduction or reproduced collector's items. Faked hobby items are presently being sold as originals, and many a hobbyist is being defrauded. The Hobby Protection Act is a positive step in the direction of instituting federal protection against what actually amounts to fraudulent advertising. I have emphasized, Mr. Speaker, the point that this nation's hobby collectors are consumers and that they do indeed have a right to some sort of consumer protection. That millions of young and old in the country can be made unsuspecting victims in the course of their own honest enthusiasm for collecting is disgraceful. One engages in a hobby to pass the hours away in enjoyment and to retain originals which may have value in the future. The reproduction or manufacture, however, of imitation collectibles. The reproduction or manufacture, however, of imitation collector's items and the deceitful sale of those items at high prices is an unscrupulous practice which must be stopped. The Hobby Protection Act provides that the manufacture of any reproduced collector's items which is not plainly marked with the calendar year in which the reproduction was made is unlawful under the Federal Trade Commission Act. In addition, the Act includes a provision that such an item must be plainly marked reproduction. The Act would also protect the hobbyist against the unsolicited receipt of blocks of four, first day covers, or other stamps on consignment in the mail. It would be pointed out that any citizen would be entitled to bring charges of violations to the Federal Trade Commission. Since the original Hobby Protection Act was introduced last summer's session, well over 8 months ago, nationwide constituent support for its enactment has been increasing steadily each month. Petitions have been coming in from coin and stamp collecting organizations across the nation in support of this bill. Individual collectors are expressing their concern and indeed impatience with the inability of Congress to offer them needed protection from fraud. Organizations such as the American Numismatic Association, the German Philatelic Society, Society of Paper Money Collectors, American Political Items Collectors, Antiquist Inc., Global Coin Traders Association, Professional Numismatist Guild, and others have indicated their strong support for the concept of a Hobby Protection Act, both in articles and editorials. Mr. Speaker, the hobbyists of America deserve protection against fraud, and we deserve to meet the challenge. I'm most hopeful that the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee will respond in the near future to the nationwide appeals on the part of individual collectors, hobby associations, and trade journals for protection against the fraudulent sale of reproduced hobby articles as originals. So I found another article from 1984, which I'm going to read to you now, and you're going to kind of find that the sports card collectors from 1972, 1973, um, they found out something quite different from what Halpern's bill actually did when it was passed. So here it is. A tough act to follow. The Times leader, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, March 9th, 1984, by Nancy Catherine Huff. It's a silly waste of time. It's a good cause, I guess, for those involved, but I think it's ridiculous. 9 years ago, the anniversary is Saturday, the federal government decided itself to create and promulgating something called the Hobby Protection Act. Now, I'm a hardcore hobbyist, dedicated to the collecting end of the pastime as well as the creative end. I collect occupied Japan antiques, period furniture from the 1930s, and little doodad boxes. When I'm not collecting, I marcane, embroider, hook rugs, paint walls and things, not pictures. Garden and one day hope to set up my own photography darkroom. When I first heard about the Hobby Protection Act, I was amazed the federal government would take the time to regulate my pastimes. What could it involve? Well, I thought maybe the feds were trying to protect me from inflated antique prices or were instituting a set of sales standards antique dealers must follow. Or perhaps I thought there may be something in there about required certification for antique dealers. I was so interested, I sent for a copy of the act, prepared to find out how my hobbies were protected or possibly restricted. Well, I was surprised. The Hobby Protection Act does not regulate my hobbies. It does not ensure that the 1932 smoking stand I paid $38 for will have all its original parts. Heck, it doesn't even regulate antique dealers, sales, or shows. I thought for sure it would somehow, someway protect the amateur collector from getting swindled. But no, the little two-page act is directed at two collectibles only: political items and numismatic items. Since I had to ask, I'm sure some of you will. Numismatic items are coins and commemorative medals. The Act regulates imitation numismatic items, not any reissue or restrike of original numismatic items by the United States or any foreign government. That's all the Act involves. No occupied Japan, no doodad boxes, no period furniture. The act is interesting, though, to those involved in collecting coins and political memorabilia. It says basically two things. Anyone selling or distributing imitation political buttons, posters, literature, stickers, or any advertisements must mark them plainly and clearly with the calendar year in which the products were manufactured. That protects the collector from buying bogus buttons, I guess. The law does go on to say the date must be presented in Arabic numerals on the back of the item where it can be easily read and understood. The law pertaining to coins and commemorative items says about the same thing. Imitations must be clearly marked "copy" in capital letters on the back of the item. That law, of course, protects us from confusing make believe money with the real thing. I shouldn't be so skeptical. I'm sure back 9 years ago, when collectors lobbied strongly to get this law passed, they were sincere in their efforts. I can't help but think, though, it was a waste of federal time to enact an entire set of rules and regulations covering two hobbies. If they were so intent on protecting the sale and distribution of coins and political memorabilia, why not take a few more days to discuss other hobbies where fraud runs rampant? I'm heartened, though, by how much afterthought the feds have gotten to this act. I've been told that there's only one guy out in Los Angeles with the Federal Trade Commission who has his finger on the pulse of this act. Thank goodness there aren't two. Dedicating two men to it would be sillier than enacting the act itself. There was a lot here that was left out of the bill, obviously, and a lot of collectors of sports cards started to notice back in the early 1970s that there was quite a bit of fraud going on. A lot of counterfeit cards that were going through shows, and this was never brought up to members of Congress. I'm not even sure if any members of Congress actually were card collectors. It's just kind of interesting that Mr. Halpern was a autograph collector, and autographs seem to be forged quite often. Out of sight, out of mind, really. And at the time, in the early 1970s, a lot of collectors were complaining, in fact, that their sports cards were going up in price. Now, this is kind of interesting because I would have thought that a lot of collectors had noticed sports cards going up in price in about 1981 throughout the 1980s, and we actually do see this. And the only reason why cards are valuable to begin with was because Jefferson Burdick instituted his card catalog and his card prices. If it wasn't for him, would cards be worth what they are now? You have to have a price guide in order for anything to go up in value. So I'm not blaming Jefferson Burdick at all. He actually knew that you had to have a price guide, otherwise, you wouldn't have a hobby. It was something that he realized. He didn't like the prices going up anyway. He didn't like values associated with sports cards, but he saw it as a necessary evil. And same with Lionel Carter, in fact, and Buck Barker, and both of those guys started to see prices of tobacco cards, T206s, go up in about 1962 or so. I remember T206s going for about $5 a piece when I was a teenager, and I just said, "Thank you very much. I'll grab that," because it was cheap. Those T206s were produced in millions upon millions of numbers in 1909 through 1911, and they were like pigeons in a park. You just couldn't get rid of them. So that's why that kept the price of those cards low for so long. And I've heard too, and maybe you guys can recount some of your stories to me about T206s uh, in the 1970s and 1980s, that a lot of them you could buy for like a couple of bucks. Even your Hall of Famers were going for about 60 to 70 bucks, like Ty Cobb. I would have loved to have grabbed a Ty Cobb T206 for 60 bucks. And I know that collectors had done that back in the early 1980s, but that's how common some of these cards were. One of the things that really kind of bothers me is the I'm not going to say the lack of education. It's getting closer to that fact. Is that our civics education is not up to snuff. I don't think it's good. I think that civics has really taken a slide, and people don't really understand how bills are proposed and instituted and laws get made. It's kind of like sausage. I know that. That's why a lot of people don't really talk about this stuff within the hobby, because it's kind of boring, but it's also necessary too. You have to have a understanding of civics and of economics, and I am going to get to the economics part of this in my next video. But this is probably one of the reasons why we're in the shape that we're in, because we don't really understand this stuff. We don't know how it affects us or other people. If there is a silver lining to any of this, I am seeing YouTubers within the hobby, such as Raul from AIH Sports, talk about the economics. But what I'm not kind of seeing is the legislative part, and what function certain government agencies play within the hobby. and within finance as well. And I think that's a very important subject to cover. Again, I know this is a little bit of a boring subject, but it really needs to be talked about and further and studied. Don't just leave it up to somebody else to tell you about this stuff. Do your own investigations. And sometimes you're going to need to go directly to the source if you don't understand something. America is made up of laws, and we're either going to be a nation of men or a nation of laws. And we can't be both. A lot of laws are not enforced, and a lot of laws and statutes are not given the money needed to enforce them. And there are a lot of stupid laws on the books, and I found a few of them here. So in Alaska, it's illegal to bring a flamingo into a barber shop. What the hell is a flamingo doing in Alaska? And why can't it get a haircut? I just just a question here. In Idaho, it's illegal to give your wife or girlfriend a box of chocolates weighing more than 50 pounds. Your wife would shoot you, I guarantee it, if you did that. In Maine, it's illegal to keep Christmas decorations up after January 14th. I kind of agree with this, but I think it should be illegal to listen to Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas. That should be banned in every single state in the union. And then in Washington state, it's a felony to harass Bigfoot or any other undiscovered species. There's a whole lot of issues there that I'm just trying to wrap my head around and I can't do it. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I greatly appreciate it as always. I know this is kind of a boring subject, but I think it's something that should be talked about. If you guys have any comments about this, let me know. And if you think that maybe this Hobbies Act should be amended to include sports cards, let me know that as well. And you can always contact your representative or your congressman to let them know why that should be. Um, Me personally, I don't think you want the federal or state governments involved any more than they may or may not already be in the hobby. I think that could be very bad for collectors. But then, again, let me know the pros and cons of that, and I will talk to you guys later. And thank you very much for stopping by again, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.